Hi, this is Lindsay, one of the co-hosts of Beauties and Headcanons. Thanks for listening to the following broadcast on Public House Media.
This is Jenna Burt, host of the Confessions of a Military Spouse podcast here on Public House Media. Thanks for listening to the following broadcast on Public House Media. Once you're done with this episode, I hope you'll come check out my show, Confessions of a Military Spouse, where we dig deep and talk about the unspoken hard truths of what it's really like to be a military spouse. A new show comes out bi-weekly. Don't forget to subscribe on iTunes so you never miss an episode of Confessions of a Military Spouse. Thanks again for checking out the following broadcast on Public House Media.
Welcome. I'm Sarah Tuberty.
And I am Nicole Kelly, and welcome to Disarming Disability. Woo! That was great. That was really nice.
It was. Welcome. We're happy that you're here. This is a podcast that is deconstructing social stigma against disability.
Yeah, that's what we're here to do. That's what we're all about.
So for today's episode, we do have an expert that is going to be talking a little bit more about the history of disability, but we'll get into that in a little bit. First off, how was your week, Nikki? Tell me, what is your current favorite TV show? Just for fun sakes and questions.
Oh man, what is my favorite TV show right now?
Of the week.
Oh, of the week. Well, I'm a little bit behind on the bandwagon, but on Netflix, have you heard of the Tidying Up with Marie Kondo show?
Oh, yes.
Yeah,
I have heard of that.
So the whole internet has been talking about this show now for, I don't know, weeks now. And I finally sat down and I finally pressed play and I finally watched it. And I watch it like many people have been inspired by this show it helps you organize and kind of clean out the stuff in your life and really therefore addressing issues that you need to work through kind of. You can tell that she is the most intentional human being on the planet. Every conversation that she's having, she's really acknowledging the other person and what their experience is. And she lives her life very intentionally and therefore comes onto the TV show with a lot of peace. And you can feel her peace through the TV screen. And it's very, it's intoxicating in its own way, actually, because everybody wants to be peaceful. Yes. So I've been inspired. We're repainting my room. We are just kind of redoing things. So yes, it's becoming a whole new place. My space is becoming a new space, a new feng shui.
Good. Yeah. And you're starting peace.
You're
starting to integrate peace into your life and being peaceful.
I am. Yeah. Over the past couple of years, I feel like I've entered into that stage of adulthood where you kind of have figured out the people who you want around and the things that make you, a better balance than your early 20s and maybe your midlife crisis that actually happens at 25 that nobody told you was going to happen at 25.
Oh my gosh. Your quarter life
crisis. It's real. It's real.
It is.
I have come out of my quarter life crisis is maybe what I'm saying. Yeah, I'm in a stage of my life where, things are pretty peaceful and I kind of know the people I'm surrounding myself with. And this is just a little bit of a good change happening around here. So what about you? Your life is all kinds of excitement.
Yeah.
What have you been up to?
I guess. I started to take a pole dancing class. It's been so powerful and I absolutely love it. And it's sort of building on some of my aerial skills that I've worked on before. And I am learning it, but I'm still really awkward in my movements because I'm just embracing that ability to be pretty with my body, I guess, because I think just sort of growing up, I experienced a lot of stigma and felt a lot ashamed of my body for a long time. Yeah. So then doing this where I'm very much making all of these very large and like movements with my body and like using my body as an instrument, sort of interacting then with this pole and then doing movements that are like a lot more fluid than what I'm used to has been very clunky, but also incredibly powerful at the same time. And I love it.
Cool. Well, shall we jump into our expert of the week?
Absolutely. So Nikki, you have an actually like really wonderful connection with our expert for today. Why don't you tell us a little bit more about him?
So I am just so elated and so thankful to introduce you. Well, I'm elated to introduce you to this person, and I'm thankful for his presence in my life. When I was in grad school 2 years ago, and I was there for journalism here in Northwestern. And I knew going into school that I wanted my focus to be specifically telling stories about people with disabilities. But my limitation was I was new to the city and I wasn't sure what the resources were or who to connect with. So I just did a simple Google research to try to figure out what were the places here in the city that really serviced people with disabilities. Happened to find the website for Access Living, which is the huge flagship organization here in the city.
And I think even broadly, like it's massive nationwide.
It's a seed of, there's lots of like independent living centers. It's technically an independent living center all over the country. Yes. So yeah. And happened to just, I probably emailed like info@accessliving.com, right? Like the most generic email. And it ended up being Adam who like bit back and ended up emailing me and inviting me in to chat with him and have a conversation. And he completely welcomed me as a graduate student. He introduced me to absolutely everyone. I was always able to walk into Access Living and use anyone there as a resource for the stories that I was doing for school. And he has just been the most incredible mentor and friend and expert and just kind of, I don't know, just an amazing, just an amazing mentor in my life. So I'm so thankful for him, and I am so excited for you to hear a conversation with him.
Adam Ballard is the Housing and Transportation Policy Analyst at Access Living in Chicago. In this role, he develops policy priorities and messaging in housing, transportation, and related planning issues. Please welcome Adam Ballard.
All right, and here we are with Adam Ballard. Adam, hello, thank you, and welcome to our show. Thank you for joining us. So Sarah and I really are looking to you as our expert today to kind of give us broad strokes of kind of specifically in America what the disability movement and policy has looked like and kind of where that started and almost who I guess our founding fathers were. I don't know, Sarah, what you would say. But yeah, where does that start in our history?
Yeah, well, we can talk about some founding mothers and fathers, some founding type figures, people who are important. I want to do that a little bit today. I also want to uplift the names at least and where I know that the stories of some people who aren't always remembered as well.
Sure.
But I think it's really important to start in Berkeley, California, in the early 1960s. At some point, we might want to go back and revisit the huge topic of what was disability like before the movement started, but that's a whole different discussion. So let's start with Berkeley in the 60s. Suffice it to say, life for people with disabilities was largely not good in that great big prehistory time, but there's a lot of fascinating stories there too. But starting in Berkeley in the 60s, some students at the University of California, primarily Ed Roberts, the father, for lack of a better word, of our movement, and he's a very key figure. He was a student at Berkeley at that time. He had a friend named Don Galloway, who was a black blind man, who was one of his best friends, and they worked together with some other disabled students at Berkeley at the time to organize for the right to live basically an integrated life on campus. Because at that time, Ed and other disabled students were housed. Their dorm basically was a wing of the hospital on campus. So if you can imagine that, going to classes, doing college stuff, trying to do the things you do in college,
But then you go home to the hospital.
Also personal life, and you go home to the hospital at the end of the day, right?
Wow.
There's no dignity in that, right?
Too, that like you're around like nursing staff and doctors and there is no privacy. There's also not a lot of independence in that aspect as well. So if you're then go to this hospital and you're sort of this like recipient of all of this care, and, if you're trying to have relationships with anybody, or if you're trying to just be by yourself, you're now dependent on nursing schedules. Yeah, trying to get laid, right? That's important. But if you're on like nursing schedules and medication schedules. Yes. No.
So we all agree that's a horrible setup.
Oh my gosh, yes, not good.
Okay, good. We're all on the same page. I figured we would be. So yeah, going to college but living in the hospital is a bad deal. Ed and Don and the rest of their friends formed a group called the Rolling Quad. Quads is a term just for quadriplegic. Again, not everyone in the group was quadriplegic. A lot of them had other physical disabilities. Some of them were blind, like Don, like I said, or had other disabilities. But they decided to call their group the Rolling Quad, and they decided to basically go to battle with the university for their right to live in a regular dorm like anyone else. They won that battle. Ed kind of used it as a launching point into a long and storied career. He was the first person with a disability ever to lead the California Department of Rehabilitation. He was their vocational rehabilitation director for a long time. That was a big thing. He founded the first ever Center for Independent Living, which is a term we'll come back to probably a few more times during this conversation. Centers for Independent Living are agencies that are staffed and governed by a majority of people with disabilities and do peer support, advocacy services, but by and for the disability community. The key term there is nothing about us without us. Mm-hmm. That's kind of the founding model of the independent living movement.
Which is a huge motto.
Where I work
and something that should be, and I think that nothing about us without us became a huge tagline for the entire movement. I think that's so important that if people are writing policies, then the people in which the policies are going to be impacting should be at the table writing them, right? That would make sense.
Before we got on the phone with you, Adam, we're just talking about literal seats at the table. If you don't have a seat at the table, then what can you do about it?
One of the things I like to say is that if you're not at the table, you're on the menu.
If you're not, though, I like that. If you're not at the table, you're on the menu.
Oh. If you're not at the table, you're on the menu. Yeah, that's an old community organizing saw that I've learned in my years of training. But yeah, that's true for any population, right? If you're not at the table, you're on the menu.
Sure.
This was a chance for the disability community to start and realize that we had power to build and take for ourselves, and that we were the experts on our lives, not even well-meaning or really good and conscious doctors or caseworkers, right? Even the best doctors and caseworkers can't speak for us the way that we can.
Correct, because they haven't lived it. They don't have that experience to know how exactly these things are going to be impacting them.
Independent living movement was born out of the Rolling Quads and out of Ed's work in founding the first center. Another figure that I just want to mention briefly in passing from this time, the first few centers for independent living then after Berkeley were also in California. Another one of the early Centers for Independent Living was actually a woman named Johnny Lacey, also ran one of the early Centers for Independent Living, and she was the first Black woman ever to have such a high position in the disability movement. So again, there's some hidden figures that don't always get talked about the same as others that we'll talk about as well, but it's important to remember folks like Don Galloway and Johnny Lacey were there at the beginning, and we'll visit some other folks as we go on. So yeah, the movement was born in California in the 60s and 70s. The 70s were a really interesting time. At that point, another key leader came on board, but from the East Coast. So Judy Heumann is another giant in the early. She comes from New York. Her story is that she's had a disability her whole life, just like Ed, Robert. But she went to college, and she actually got through college and got her certification to be a school teacher in New York City, but could not find an accessible school to teach in. And the New York City schools refused to work with her to help her find a placement that would work for her. And that was kind of her wake-up call, and that's how she got into the movement. Her and Ed kind of joined forces. Judy and Ed Roberts kind of joined forces in the 70s. They started taking disability work international while still building, the movement in the U.S. One of the big things that they did together in the 70s was help make sure that one of the earliest pieces of really major legislation for the disability community got passed. So in 1973, the Rehabilitation Act was passed. It's still, there's a bigger law on the horizon that we'll get to in a few minutes. Even now, certain provisions of the Rehab Act are some of the most important pieces of civil rights legislation that we have in the disability community. Section 504 especially says that if federal funding is involved in any program, service, or activity, if you're getting federal money to do anything, whether you're a nonprofit or a corporate vendor, you cannot discriminate against people with disabilities in the provision of any program, services, and activities funded by that money. And that still is a huge piece of the law today. We can't leave 504 yet historically either, because Section 504 was also the impetus for a big part of the story of the 70s that I want to tell. So Section 504 and the Rehab Act as a whole were passed in 1973. However, in 1977, 4 years later, there had still been no regulations. So how legislation works is, a law is passed, it goes into statute, but then to actually implement that law, you have to write regulations that explain some of the details of how the law is going to work, right? So 4 years after the passage of Section 504, there's still been no regulations signed actually implementing Section 504 and making it an actual law with teeth.
And Adam, can I clarify for a second? Yeah. And do different states write different regulations? Is that correct? Or is this because it's a federal law that then this becomes federal regulations? At what point does the state interpret the law?
It depends on the law. So for a federal law like the Rehab Act, it takes federal action to write those regulations. Since Section 504 especially was the holdup, because it was so broad and so sweeping, it basically impacted every major federal agency, and they all had to come up with what their 504 regulations were going to be. But primarily at the time, and there's been some reorganizations in the federal government since, but in the 70s, the big department that was most impacted was the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, and they were just dragging their feet. They were refusing to get their 504 regs in order. Group of leaders, a lot of them in Berkeley. This is actually where the movement starts to pan out across the country, though. But Berkeley, again, was the epicenter. Leaders in Berkeley, including Ed Roberts, Judy Heumann was living there at the time, or at least traveling there a lot. I'm not sure the details, but was there a lot. So Ed, Judy, some new characters come in at this point. There's a guy named Brad Lomax, who was actually a member of the Black Panther Party, but also a wheelchair user who lived in the Bay Area. He became involved in the movement at this time. So he helped plan what I'm about to talk about. These leaders came together and planned a series of sit-ins across the country. On the same day, people with disabilities occupied, I want to say, at least about 20 federal buildings across the country.
Cool. Disability history, yes!
Yay! So back to the 504 sit-in. 1977, 504 regulations haven't been signed. The disability community mobilizes and takes direct action by occupying 20 or so federal buildings. Most of those occupations ended after a day or two for understandable reasons. Sometimes the police response was a little more aggressive. Sometimes the people who were holding down the building just didn't have enough support to maintain the occupation. That's great. However, things in Berkeley continued for almost a month. Again, I don't remember the exact number of days, but it was near a month that the Berkeley crew held the building I think the building itself was in San Francisco. So the occupation happened at the San Francisco federal building for nearly a month. A lot of people held the building the whole time. Some of the key leaders like Ed and Judy were flying back and forth from San Francisco to D.C. to try and negotiate to end the occupation. It happened. After about, again, nearly a month, Secretary Califano, who was the head of the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare at the time, finally agreed to sign the regs and get them done. So it worked. So the 504, yay, victory!
We did it.
And also amazing that was in 77, that it took this long for these things to happen.
The world was still very, very inaccessible back then, and we held a federal building for almost a month. I would recommend to people listening that if you want to see some footage from these protests, they're really a watershed moment in the movement. There's a short film on YouTube called The Power of 504. It's not super updated. It was made in the 80s or something, or early 90s. But it's still, I think, the best document of what really happened during those days in San Francisco. So yeah, look at The Power of 504.
We're going to go ahead and link that on our website. So if you go to Disarming Disability and go to this episode, the Adam Ballard episode, you will find that right there within the episode. We'll link it there.
Okay, so before I move on, any other questions from you guys?
I'm ready. Yay, we did it. Yay. And then, so what happens next? I'm waiting. I'm on the edge of my seat, Adam. I'm on the edge of my seat. What happens next?
We're telling a story. Okay, so next the community realized, that we had won the 504 fight, and that was great, but there was still a lot of parts of public life that were impacted by the federal government and federal funding in particular, right? So it was time to push even more aggressive legislation to make the rest of the world accessible. I'm going to talk about one piece of legislation that was passed before the big one, the ADA. A couple years before the ADA was passed, the Fair Housing Act, which is actually a civil rights law that had been passed in 1968 to prevent discrimination based on the basis of race. The Fair Housing Act was amended in 1988 to include other protected classes besides just race, and due to the efforts of our community, disability was included as a protected class under the Fair Housing Act. So now discrimination in housing, which is a really complicated issue and could be a whole topic on its own, but discrimination in housing against people with disabilities is at least on paper illegal And we've been able to make a lot of advances in making housing accessible based on having the Fair Housing Act amendment. So that's important. That happened in 1988. It kind of gets lost in the shuffle because of what happens just 2 years later. But it's important to realize that there's new cast of characters emerging at this time. Judy Heumann's still an important leader in the movement during the 80s, but Ed's health kind of worsens. He kind of takes a step back for most of the 80s, and he passes away, actually, unfortunately, in the early 90s. In the 80s, a new cast of leaders kind of come to the fore. One of these is a man named Justin Dart. He is a Texan. Every picture you see of Justin Dart is him sitting in his wheelchair with his little granny glasses and a huge cowboy hat.
Awesome. Yes.
Yeah, so that's Justin Dart. He's a Texas businessman. Comes from like some kind of rich family. I can't remember what they did exactly, but he's done well. But Justin's the kind of guy who wanted to use his position and his resources to help others and create, and more importantly, create lasting change. Justin and his wife, Yoshiko is still alive. Justin passed away in the early 2000s, but Yoshiko is still with us. I've met Yoshiko. Justin had passed a long time before I became part of the movement, but meeting Yoshiko Dart is kind of like meeting Mother Teresa in the disability community. It's not the best metaphor, but it's the best one I can come up with right now.
Based on the way you described him, I wanted you to say Dolly Parton, but I think what you said is a much more lovely version.
Right.
Cool.
Yeah. I mean, Yoshiko is lovely, but in a much different way than Dolly Parton, who I also love. Yeah, but I mean, she's great. She continues his legacy. She's really big these days on supporting, newer and emerging leaders, young leaders in the movement. So a lot of us my age and younger who have met her at any point, even if you just meet her for about 5-10 minutes, she remembers you. She stays in touch. Some of us will get postcards every once in a while that just say, keep doing what you're doing, lead on. And lead on, it was Justin's battle cry. So
that gave me goosebumps for real, actually. Yeah.
She's an amazing person. You look up her story as well. But Justin Dart, Yoshiko Dart, and my boss, Martha Bristow, who is the founder and CEO of Access Living, all were heavily involved in the 80s in making the Fair Housing Act amendments happen first. And then now, it's time to start talking about the ADA. So even while we're fighting to have disability added to the Fair Housing Act, we know there's still more to be done to create access in public spaces, especially transportation, businesses, and just other public accommodations. A lot of folks work hard together. People in the community like Justin and Martha are working on this as leaders in the community. We have a lot of allies who join us at this time. Someone who both Nikki and I have a lot of esteem for, Senator Tom Harkin.
My favorite person in the entire planet.
Yes, he was the Senate champion for the ADA as it came together. Another person I want to shout out, another major ally that doesn't always get as much attention as he should, and it's funny that I called him Major because his name was Major. Representative Major Owens was a congressman from New York who was basically the floor leader on the House side. So Tom Harkin ran points in the Senate, and Major Owens, who was a black congressman from New York City, was the main reason it got passed in the House. Through Congressman Owens and Senator Harkin's work, the ADA gets hammered out. It gets to the point where it's ready to go, and things stop. It never gets called for a final vote. And this is the point where another iconic action in the history of the disability movement happens. We just alluding at it a couple minutes ago, but at this point, because the bill's not moving in the House, or maybe it's the Senate at this point. Again, I'm going to get some of these details wrong, but it's just stalled. It's not being called for a final vote, even though we know we have the votes to pass it. Mm-hmm. So the disability community holds the march in D.C. Leaders like Marka and Justin Dart and Yoshiko Dart are at the front of the parade. Bob Kafka, who was and is a key leader in ADAPT, which we might talk about really briefly towards the end, at the front. And this procession, hundreds of people strong, many of them in wheelchairs or on crutches or with guide dogs or, taking interpretation from an ASL interpreter. This army of disabled people marches down Pennsylvania Avenue and gets to the Capitol. At that point, no one's 100% sure really still at this point exactly how it started. A few people have taken credit for coming up with the idea, but someone comes up with the idea once the parade gets there that, we should really get some people climbing the stairs of the Capitol. Yeah. At the time, the Capitol was barely accessible. It's not like the Capitol building itself was completely inaccessible, but it was barely accessible. There was one really tiny elevator that went up into the rotunda from the visitor center beneath, which was accessible. But yeah, the only way you were going to get there was to
take a really rickety, old, narrow, tight elevator to get up there. That's not real access. That's not what the promise of the ADA is about.
Yep.
So to dramatize the fact that we're not being listened to, a bunch of people, I think I've seen at least a couple dozen, cited as the estimate, a couple dozen people get out of their wheelchairs and start crawling up the steps of the Capitol. One of the first ones up the stairs is a 9-year-old girl. Can't remember her name right now, but it's a 9-year-old girl from Denver, I believe. And she's interviewed by the evening news, CBS, NBC, ABC are all there, sticking microphones in her face while she's climbing the steps.
Yeah.
And it's an amazing, there's footage, you can find that. It's an amazing footage of the interview with her, but it's some really iconic photos of other people just struggling up the steps. But again, it was all over the evening news that night. And at that point, Congress had been sufficiently shamed. The bill came up for a vote within days and passed overwhelmingly. Later that summer.
Sorry, I apologize for interrupting. Can you just very quickly give the explanation of what the ADA is for those who maybe are joining and that is they don't know?
Yeah, and this is like we were saying earlier, this is a thing we might break down even more another time, but just as an overview. Yeah, the American Disabilities Act is huge. It has 5 titles. I won't go through all 5 titles because some of them are really technical. But the idea is that the sweeping piece of civil rights legislation for people with disabilities. I didn't really mention this earlier when we were talking about Berkeley, but the movement was really born out of and inspired by struggles for civil rights, right? Especially the movement for Black civil rights, but also the women's movement. Queer liberation was starting out in its infancy at that time. And the community really, the disability community said, well, if all these other communities can use civil rights as their rallying cry, why can't we? And we did, and it's worked for the most part, right? So the ADA is a civil rights law that provides civil rights protections, people with disabilities to be able to access public accommodations is the biggest thing it does. 2 things I like to say about the ADA, just kind of philosophically real quick, is that it both promises both frustratingly, sometimes unrealized, especially in employment. The ADA really does, on paper, have some strong provisions that should make it easier for people with disabilities to find and keep jobs. But the reality is that our employment status hasn't changed significantly at all, even since the ADA was passed. And not for reasons of the ADA itself. It's still the world we live in largely. But, the ADA sometimes feels frustratingly like we haven't reached its full potential. At the same time, when I'm working in community work especially and working with community partners who maybe disability isn't their thing, which always gets me a little bit because I'm like, okay, listen, if you're the food pantry, you're serving people with disabilities, so disability should be one of your things. But anyway,
right.
I mean, and that, it should be part of your frame. If you're a nonprofit or any kind of do-gooder work, I don't care who you're focusing on. If your frame doesn't at least include disability as part of it, you're not serving everyone you could. Because we're everywhere. We intersect with every other community, right? So anyway, that pet peeve aside, when I'm talking with these community partners about how, they can do better at being welcoming and including people with disabilities, I often caution them, like, the ADA is out there and it's a good signpost. But it's really just the beginning. It's like, don't frame the question as, what do I need to do to become ADA compliant? Because you can get to ADA compliance on paper and still leave out a lot of people with disabilities.
And truthfully, too, in part of my schooling, one of the projects that we did is that we had the ADA compliance guidelines for bathrooms, and so we went into a public building, and that was ADA compliant. So we had to measure how far away is the toilet paper from the toilet, how high is the toilet from the ground, where are the grab bars, and technically it was ADA compliant. But if you were to actually use that bathroom, it wasn't helpful, and we also evaluated accessible parking spaces. And so yes, technically there has to be X amount and however many times, but this is the accessible parking space. And then the door opens up to a fence that's around a tree. So how can someone be able, because if we're trying to transfer someone in and out of a car, there isn't the space to do that. So yes, okay, fine, this fits the guidelines, but it's not practical. You're right. Yes. Absolutely. It's not practical. Yeah. So translating those things to be how can we actually really make sure that these things are accessible? Right.
I always advise people, do ADA compliance, but don't think you've done it once you're done with the compliance. Then you have to keep talking to the people you're serving and find out what they need still, because because the other thing that we talk about is the idea of creating access in a space for a wide variety of people, because, different people with different kinds of disabilities need different things. And sometimes those needs can come into conflict or overlap with each other. And that's something that you have to negotiate sometimes. Like, for instance, we'll have meetings sometimes at Access Living where it's a big group meeting. And in order for some people to participate in that meeting, they need to make sure that every time someone speaks, they have a microphone.
Mm-hmm.
In order, because of, for whatever reason, sometimes it's hearing reasons, sometimes it's just processing reasons, they need to have amplified voices in order to be able to fully participate. At the same time, there might be people with different sensory needs related, to autism or other kinds of disabilities, where being in that kind of environment where there's a lot of amplified voices, it's not good for them. So it's like, well, how do we split that difference where we're creating access for as many people as possible, right? And there's not a hard and fast answer to that. The answer is you're always in conversation with people. You're always negotiating. Access is always a negotiation. So get your ADA compliance straight, good, but keep talking to the people that are coming and find out what their actual access needs are. Don't assume, right? People have all kinds of invisible disabilities too. Even people with visible disabilities have other invisible disabilities. So don't assume from looking at
what their access needs are. You have to ask them.
Sure. And I think it's really important to highlight that word access, right? Because I think it can often be seen as like, oh, this person has a need and I have to provide this. And and I feel like there's this sense of like burden on someone else to like do these things, whatever. But I think that it's that like all we're doing is creating access, which means that someone is trying to get through this barrier that they're not creating, that is being created by this establishment or this group or whatever. And all we're doing is opening up that door so that person can be able to access that. And I think that that's a really powerful aspect where it's not like we're trying to undo all of this stuff or whatever, because I think some people can kind of see like, oh, well, I don't want to have to change all these things about my building. It's just about like, how can we make sure that people are accessing all this information? So I think that's just an important word to highlight.
That gets us through the history of the ADA. Another area that the ADA, so we talk about how the ADA addressed employment, but it hasn't had much success. An area that the ADA really didn't directly address was the fact that a lot of people with disabilities are still institutionalized in different kinds of institutions. It could be a nursing home, it could be mental institutions, it could be a lot of different places. But a lot of people with disabilities who, if they had the proper services and supports, could live independently, aren't getting those services, and so they end up in institutions. The ADA didn't directly tackle that, but 9 years after the ADA passed, there was a Supreme Court decision in 1999 called the Olmstead decision that actually used the ADA as its base. Using the ADA as their justification, the justices on the Supreme Court said that you can't institutionalize someone with a disability if they're able to live successfully in the community. It's a violation of their civil rights to do so based on what the ADA says. So, 1999, been now, 19 years even since Olmstead. We've made some progress. Olmstead provides a legal basis for people to now file class action lawsuits against states or other entities that are responsible for institutionalizing people. So we've seen some gains there, but there's still a lot of people trapped, and we're still trying to get them out. Hopefully the next big piece of the puzzle is a piece of legislation called the Disability Integration Act. National Adapt is about to launch this bill again. Keep an eye out, and you probably want to include links to information on the DIA, because by the time people hear this, it will have been released again. So the DIA, the Disability Integration Act, basically gets rid of what's called an institutional bias in Medicaid. So since so many people with disabilities are on lower fixed incomes, a lot of us qualify for Medicaid as our primary form of health insurance. And Medicaid, unfortunately, has a bias where it would rather pay for institutional care than home-based care, even though institutional care costs so much more. So not only is it like a violation of human rights, it also makes no financial sense. But the DIA would fix that. It would basically end Medicaid's institutional bias and do some other things, make some other technical fixes so that it would flip the system. Where right now, you have to seek exemptions from institutional care in order to be placed in the community. It would flip things around where community care would be what you're entitled to. And if you needed institutional care for something else, you would have to get that, right? The DIA is a really important piece of the puzzle. It also includes housing resources, because one of the big barriers to people not getting out of institutions, besides not having care, is not having adequate housing. So DIA also has some housing resources that will hopefully help get people out as well. So that's been a big focus for a lot of the disability community since the ADA. We're also focusing, like I said, ongoing unemployment. We still have not really figured out how to crack that nut, but we keep trying. My current role is focused on housing and transportation, as I said. Transportation is again kind of a brave new world. When the ADA was written, we got access to all forms of public transportation at the time, but the public transportation world has changed a lot, even in the last few years, right? I'm talking about things like ride share, bike share, scooter share, micro transit, all these private options that are coming into what was just a public transportation world and really complicating things. But a lot of these services don't feel like the ADA is subject to them because of how the ADA was written, because the ADA was written not anticipating them, right? So we're in a lot of court fights now. The community across the country has multiple cases filed trying to get the courts to make it clear that any new service has to still comply with the ADA. But again, there's another area where ADA compliance is just the beginning, because the transportation world could look a whole lot different in 5 years than it does now. And so we're trying to really be at the front end. Because what happened with the old legacy transportation system is the ADA came along later, and it forced transportation systems to retrofit accessibility in, right? You had to go back and you had to add lifts and ramps to buses. You had to find ways to get elevators and train stations where you could. It was all about forcing accessibility into an existing system, right? Our hope here is to not make that mistake again and build accessibility into as many of these systems up front so we don't have to go back and through legislation or litigation fix it later. That's another big avenue for disability world going forward as well.
Absolutely. Adam, thank you so very much for your time and for your expertise and for allowing us to just berate you with questions.
Yeah, no problem.
I think it's really important to Sarah and I. So much of the lean and the importance of this is, yes, we want to get right now, we're focused on basics, but just looking at the community as a whole. And part of it is, I mean, we talked about access early, making what's going on in the community accessible to those of us who are looking to know what's going on, but maybe aren't necessarily experts. So helping to be a direct pipeline to people like you who are the experts. And providing information to get everybody up to speed and to know what's going on. So thank you so much for your time again. I will happily bother you and buy you a beer whenever you would like.
Both of us. That's not
Sounds
just
good.
Yeah, that's right. Sorry. Sarah's here in Chicago.
Yeah,
we're going. We'll buy you a beer at your convenience. So you just let us know.
All right. That sounds good. We'll figure it out.
Cool.
Look forward to it.
Thank you so much. And we'll bother you later.
Yes.
All right, I'll talk to you guys soon. Thanks so much.
Bye, Adam.
Great. Thanks, Adam. We want to give special thanks to our network, Public House Media. For our intro beats, Jason Barnes at Cybernetics. For our logo art, Patrice, you can find him at normalpersons.com. And Matt Meldrum and Ryan Louie, our two-handed technical team. Bye. Subscribe on Apple Podcasts or publichousemedia.org. Follow us on Twitter at DisarmDisable. Follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Disarming Disability, and check out our website, disarmingdisability.com. See you next week. Bye.